So thank you everyone for joining. We are formally starting our webinar today, and we have already Jonathan Wells with us. We are welcoming him, and I hope in a few minutes there will be more participants like you. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to a very successful webinar today. And so let's begin with a short introduction of Way to Jannah Academy. So Way to Jannah Academy started its journey in the year 2020 in the month of Ramadan, and it's basically an online educational institution. Okay, and we are working to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we are working for the betterment of humanity, and we are aligned with the goal of fourth goal of SDG. We know about sustainable development goals, and the fourth number is education, quality education. So we are working in alignment with that goal. And our main focus is on educating people. We are aware of the line from the point সাম্যবাদী বিশ্বের যা কিছু মহান সৃষ্টি চিরকল্যাণকর অর্ধেক তার করিয়াছে নারী অর্ধেক তার নর. That is why we want to make sure that we have enough involvement of both males and females at our academy. So let me talk about the purpose of this academy. There are 6 points to mention: motivating people to dream for a better world, helping people to learn, teach, and work online, making people conscious about various important aspects of our life, spreading valid knowledge, and making good-hearted people, bridging the gaps among people of different fields, and doing dawah work. Okay. And the program you have joined today is named as Linguistics Talk. This is basically an online program which has been introduced with the desire to arrange regular sessions with a 7 to 12 days interval. One session of this program was conducted long days ago, and now we are thinking of continuing this program, and you will be getting sessions regularly, inshallah. And the idea is that there will be a guest speaker or a lecturer and a beautiful and energetic audience. The speaker and practicing linguist and or a teacher of language and or linguistics at a university or a student of linguistics with good knowledge of the field will give a lecture on a specific area of linguistics, and after the lecture, persons will be able to ask speaker questions. Okay, so this way a good knowledge, idea, and thought sharing environment will be created, and participants will be able to make connections with real linguistics practitioners and students of linguistics. So today we have our guest Jonathan Wells, and let me talk about him a bit. So it's a really pleasure to have Jonathan Wells as our guest. He is an MPhil student in linguistics and a graduate research assistant at the Language and Brain Lab at Oxford. Jonathan's academic journey began with a strong foundation in languages. He earned bachelor's degrees in Russian, French, and Italian from the University of Oklahoma. He also spent an academic year in St. Petersburg, Russia, and attended an intensive summer course in Grenoble, France, to deepen his language studies. Before coming to Oxford, Jonathan focused on the Pamir languages of Central Asia, translating key linguistic works from Russian to English. He has extensive teaching experience, having tutored Russian, French, Italian, and Spanish at the University of Oklahoma, and even taught biblical Hebrew for various organizations. Wow. Currently, his research interests center on historical linguistics, particularly the Anatolian and Celtic languages. His thesis explores Hittite metrical phonology, aiming to create a unified account of stress placement of using rule-based framework. Jonathan is also the recipient of the Anna Marpurgo Davis Master's Bursary and the creator of the Luwian Type LaTeX package for typing in hieroglyphic Luwian. In addition to his thesis work, he is actively involved in EEG experiments and Pratt data analysis at the Language and Brain Lab, where he contributes to research on Bengali English aspiration patterns. So Here we are welcoming Jonathan once again and asking him to start his presentation right now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashik. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk to you guys. I'm thrilled to see a bunch of people on here and interested in this topic. This is something that can be a little bit niche, so I'm always thrilled when I see people who are like, yeah, let's go hear this guy, ramble a little bit about Hittite linguistics. And I'm really thrilled to be able to do this online as well. I think things that one of the things that always excites me the most when I'm doing anything teaching related is the idea of what I like to call democratization of information. None of what I'm doing matters unless I can get it out to people, unless I can show people and say, "Hey, this is really cool. Hopefully this is something that's going to be useful and helpful." So, really appreciate the opportunity. So let's go ahead and get right into it. What I have here is a presentation that I've entitled "The Rhythms of the Past," and it's got the subtitle here, "Exploring the Metrical Phonology of Hittite." And you can see here that I've got the cuneiform on the screen for the name of the Hittite capital city, which was Hattusas. And we will take a look actually at exactly where that was in just a minute. So, as we look at the Hittite language, one of the things that I think is really important is to kind of understand Hittite in context. Even having done as much sort of linguistic stuff that I had in my undergraduate studies, I really didn't know that much about the Hittites specifically. It wasn't something that I had come across. I mostly worked with modern languages. So this is a language that has a really fascinating history. It was spoken from about the 17th to 13th centuries BCE, and is part of an extinct group of languages, the Anatolian group. And these together make up part of the Indo-European language family, together with Bangla and German and Latin and all of these that are really, really widely spread across the globe. In fact, it is, I believe, the widest spoken language group in the world. And these were not only an extinct group of languages. So one of the fascinating things about doing this study is that the joke I usually make is that I do phonology on dead people. So there are no remaining speakers of this language or any descendant languages, and this entire group of languages has just entirely died out. And they were probably the earliest group of Indo-European languages to break off. There has been some debate about that over the years, and you'll see this phrased in terms of the Indo-Hittite hypothesis. And to a greater or lesser degree, that is basically an accepted position now, with some people kind of taking stronger and some people taking weaker formulations of that. But that is generally considered to be the case at this stage. Um, with that being the case, given that this is such an archaic language and language family, this is one of the ones that is most interesting to us as historical linguists because we get to take a look at something that is about as close as we can get in our written record to what Proto-Indo-European would have been like. Now, in some ways, it's very innovative. There are certain things it does not seem to have a masculine feminine gender distinction, for instance, which is very widespread in other Indo-European languages. And there's some debate as to whether that's original or whether that's an innovation on the part of the Hittites. But there are certain features like that that can be very archaic and might give us a sense of some of the things that we could find or expect to find if we were to have a speaker of Proto-Indo-European in front of us. A couple of other interesting things to note here. So they actually called themselves the Nesili, and you can see I've once again given that in the cuneiform here, meaning the city of the people of Nesa. And if you look at this map, can you guys see my mouse? I'm not 100% sure if that's a visible
Yeah, it's
thing.
visible. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so right here you can see this city labeled Kanish, and Kanish was also called Nesa. So this is where the name that they gave themselves comes from. It's from this city right here, and you can see this is basically a map of what we would now call Turkey, and then some of Jordan and a few other and Egypt and some other places here. and well, and Greece off on the west. And you can see that the fullest extent of their empire really was fairly large. So we get records of Hittite being spoken, or at least in written transmission across large parts of this area. Westward, you can see they don't quite extend as far northwest as Wilusa, which we would know as Troy. That was, in all likelihood, probably a Luvian city. And then in the southwest, you can see there's this area called Lucca, which is a Lycian speaking area. But then all of this area here, especially, was basically Hittite territory. Up here, we would have Palaic. And then down here, where you see Tarhuntassa and Kitsuatna, those were basically Luvian areas as well. And then if you look down here, another really interesting thing is we get Hittite records as far south as Ugarit, which was a Semitic speaking city. That's a language that's fairly closely related to Hebrew and Arabic. And then Byblos, which was for a long time one of the major Phoenician capitals. So their empire really extends quite a long way. And this results in them contacting lots of different populations over the centuries, and that gives us a bit of a funny situation because the English name Hittites actually derives from Biblical Hebrew. So the Hebrews called them the Hittim, which is basically a misnomer. So prior to the Hittites living in this area, there was a group called the Hattians, and the Hattians were the ones that gave their name to the area, and the Hebrews basically started calling people from that space the Hattians, and then kept calling them that and never bothered changing the name. So that was what we got via the Bible. We kind of got a sense of, okay, there's some people up there that might have been called something like the Hittites. And we do also find them calling themselves the people of the city of Hattusa. But in, reference to their own language, they were calling themselves the Nesili. So there's a little bit of the historical background of what we're looking at. And one of the things that is most striking about the Hittites, and that provides us with basically a lot of the challenge for the study that we're engaged in this case, is the Hittite writing system was a cuneiform writing system, which some of you may be familiar with. And you can see I've got this lovely tablet here. This is a plague remedy tablet. So this was something that the Hittite priests would do. It was a ritual to ward off a plague, and you get obviously quite a long set of instructions in this wedge-shaped cuneiform writing system. And the most important thing about this to note is that cuneiform was not designed for Hittite. So cuneiform is a script that was designed best we can tell anyway, was designed by the Sumerians, which is a language isolate group. So as far as we know, there are no surviving records of any related language to Sumerian. So in all likelihood, there were other languages like that in that area, but they never ended up writing anything down, at least not that we've found. So they devise this writing system and then they pass it on to Akkadian speaking people like the Assyrians, who, of course, are a Semitic speaking people group. So this immediately introduces some complications because when you are transferring a writing system from a language which is not like any other language in the world to a language which is like a few other languages in the world, you're probably going to come into some conflict, and there was. And then that ended up getting transferred later to the Hittites, which is an Indo-European language. So you can get this set of transfers causes lots of problems, in particular because unlike most Semitic languages and unlike certainly Sumerian, Indo-European languages like Hittite, and certainly we have lots of really famous examples like Polish, are really fond of consonant clusters. We get lots of consonant clusters in these languages, and the writing system just wasn't designed for that. So what we find is a writing system that is basically syllabographic in nature with a few different ideographic signs as well. So rather than, for instance, an alphabetic value of something like r, you would just have rari ru. And so if you see something in a Hittite text that is spelled haraka, it absolutely could be read like that. Or, and in this case, we happen to know for a fact that it actually should be read hark, where the middle vowel is what we call a purely orthographic vowel. It's just it's entirely an artifact of the writing system, and it's not meant to actually be read. So we immediately start to get into some problems because, as we'll get into a little bit later, metrical phonology, one of the things that matters the most is knowing where the vowels are and knowing what kind of length do we have and some of this other data that this writing system immediately makes very obscure. So let's take a look at how that works out in practice. I have an example of some Hittite text here, and this is just one sort of question sentence that I thought was a good sample of what some of this can look like. And you'll see if you're reading a Hittite text, you'll see some that are like this, some that are a little bit more in one direction or another, but this is a reasonably representative example. So we get this cuneiform string here, and you can see there's not really any differentiation in the cuneiform between what you'll notice below it, where below it you can see all of this capitalization and other things going on, and the cuneiform just doesn't indicate any of that. Now, what we do in scholarly practice when we're reading cuneiform is, at least for Hittite cuneiform and different varieties of languages that use the writing system will treat this differently. But for scholarly practice with Hittite, what we do is we highlight, oops, excuse me. Let's see. We highlight Hittite text in italics. So you can see that in the Nu, the Quit, and Yassi. And then we highlight Sumerian text in capital letters. So that's Munus, Lugal, and Gashan. And then Akkadian text in capital italics. So that's that Ya right after Gashan right here. And then the angled equal sign marks in clitics. So we have this kind of mixed transcription system that sort of helps us to understand what's going on, but is also a little bit hard on the eyes and can be a little bit brutal to look at, especially as you're learning it. And what we've done here, so I've got a few little things that I want us to look at. So first of all, let's just look at the various pieces. So Nu is just a connector. Munus Lugal means queen in Sumerian. Gashan means lady in Sumerian, and we can see it's got this little thing affixed to it, this ya, and ya actually is an Akkadian grammatical possessive, meaning mine. So this is my lady with a mixed Sumerian and Akkadian writing. And then we have quit, which is the what question word in the accusative singular, and we have yasi, which means to do, and it's in the present tense basically with a second person singular inflection. So we get this whole string put together, and we're trying to figure out how to read it. And this translates to, what will the queen, my lady, do? One of the interesting things, and like I say, there are lots of interesting things as we go through this, but one of the interesting things is that these Sumerian and Akkadian pieces are not meant to be read this way. So as we read the text, we might look at it and say, okay, nu munus lugal gashanya quiti yasi, which would be very nice. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And we've learned from studying Hittite that actually what was happening in most cases is that they were actually pronouncing the Hittite word when they saw a Sumerian word or when they saw an Akkadian word. So in the case of Munus Lugal, we know that that means queen. So the two pieces, Munus is a woman and Lugal is a king. So a woman king is what we would call a queen. And you can see that the Hittite equivalent I've glossed down here is Hassusaras. And likewise with Gashan, we know that that is Sumerian for lady, but the Hittite equivalent is Ishassaras. And you can see these are very likely, these might well be related words. And then we get this ya, which in Hittite would be mis. So if you were to actually read this as in Hittite, and I've provided how we would transcribe this in normal practice. I'm so sorry. There we go. I've provided how we would transcribe this in normal practice, but you can see I've also given you the IPA here below, is we would transcribe it like this, and it would be pronounced Nuhassusaras ishassaras mis quitiyasi, right? So you can see it actually gets quite a bit longer, and they're using the Hittite words behind this. And we can tell that based on the fact that in a lot of cases, we can actually see Hittite grammatical pieces being added to these words. So this gives you a sense of what the text looks like. And why might this be an issue is basically because with these Sumerian and Akkadian components, this obscures the Hittite word behind it. And in some cases, like these ones, we're lucky. They have spelled it out somewhere. They wrote it out all the way. And so we know what word it's actually referring to. But in some cases, that's not the case, especially when we're dealing with poetic texts that might have some obscure vocabulary and other things. And poetic texts are really helpful if we're trying to find stress data. But the problem is poetic texts might also be using obscure vocabulary, and they are more prone to using these kinds of ideograms that represent other languages, and that can really get in the way of our understanding exactly how those are structured. So let's talk about now how metrical phonology works, and we're going to start to kind of mesh this together. So A lot of you in your courses may or may not have come into contact with metrical phonology. I certainly did not have much contact with it until I started graduate school. So this is just a brief overview of uh, what this study is. It's basically the study of stress patterns, and there are two main approaches, two different ways that you can go about doing this. The first way is to use optimality theory, and optimality theory, some of you may be aware, uses constraints to generate output forms from input forms. So basically, we're going to say, well, we're starting with this word and we want to get here, and we have to figure out in between what the different constraints are that will get us there. Those are violable, meaning they can be violated or broken, and it's reliant on the ordering. So we might have something, and Tony Yates proposes this for Hittite. He says, well, maybe we have something like a rule that says we'd love to have stress towards the left side, but we can break that rule. In fact, that's the weakest rule in Hittite. Excuse me, I think my headphones just died, so I'm going to plug these in really quickly. But There we go. Let's try this again. There we are. So the rules that we get can be violated, and this is how we would handle this from an optimality theoretic approach. Now, there are a variety of issues with that. It's very, very popular in the phonological world, but it's something that I don't tend to subscribe to. I think it's got some fairly major theoretical issues that you can feel free to look up. There are plenty of articles written back and forth on this topic, and you can feel free to take your own position. But the approach that I tend to use is what I call a rules-based parsing. And this is essentially based on the work of Bruce Hayes in the 1970s, and then more recently Aditi Lahiri in the last, 20 years or so. And this uses rules which are not violable, they cannot be broken, to generate output forms on the basis of a parsing algorithm. So we're going to go through and we're going to treat this algorithmically, we're going to take it apart, and every word is going to be essentially um, uh, programmatically assigned a stress. So these are kind of the two different ways we can do that. And if we do it that way, we have four big questions that we're trying to answer that constitute the main meat of a rules-based parsing algorithm. And these four questions are about, number one, foot-headedness. And that means basically if we're going through and we're grouping syllables into chunks, are the syllables grouped with a strong syllable and a weak syllable, or is it the other way around? And that's going to matter for the places that we are allowed to assign stress. So a strong syllable, we can assign stress on. A weak syllable, we can't. And it could be vice versa, right? So if it's strong to weak, then that's what we call a trochaic parsing system. If it's weak to strong, that's what we call an iambic parsing system. And that might be something that you guys are familiar with from poetry, because we use those same terms, maybe a little bit confusingly, to also refer to various types of poetry and the ways that that can be organized, right? So, for instance, if you're looking at Shakespeare, that's what's in called iambic pentameter. But to be very clear, these are separate things. So just because a language has an inherently iambic structure does not mean that their poetry does. English, for instance, has a trochaic structure, but its poetry, in the case of iambic pentameter, can be iambic. So they're related concepts, but it's important to keep these kind of separate. The next thing we're concerned about is parsing directions. So do we start from the left or the right edge of the word when we're going through and breaking things up? Then we're asking about number three, end rule, meaning does stress land, once we've got these broken into groups, does stress land on the leftmost or on the rightmost group of syllables? And then finally, what we're asking is there any sort of extra metricality involved? And this is something that we usually try and avoid, but it does crop up. So English again comes up in as an example, and Latin does as well. So both Latin and English have entirely extrametrical final syllables. They just don't get counted into the parsing algorithms at all. So how do we get this data out of Hittite? And this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. This is where we really have to marry these two things and figure out how they work together. So data is often best acquired by noting instances of what we call plene spelling, and that means full spelling in Latin. That is to say specifically spelling with extra vowels. So when they've got this writing system, they've got this word ne pisas, which means the sky. And if they've written it down, they could just write it ne pisas. Or if we're really lucky and they have done this, we might see them spell it like this: ne with that extra in there and then pisas. And that tells us that we have a long vowel on that e. Now that doesn't necessarily guarantee stress. I want to be really clear about that. but it's a really strong indicator. So if we see a word spelled over and over and over with a long vowel in a particular location, that is a very strong indicator that we have stress in that position on that word. And we can actually see the Hittites will vary this if we have like a mobile stress paradigm or something like this. They will write these long vowels in different places to show that, which is very, very helpful. Now, that being said, they don't always do that, but it's nice when they do. And one of the other things that we can use, and there are other sort of more arcane systems we can use to devise the or to divine this, but one of the other relatively straightforward ways is we can see vocalic ablaut, and this means basically changes in the vowels. So when it is stressed, sometimes the vowel a will become a, and you'll see that in especially verb endings. You'll see something like the first person plural verb ending wani becoming weni when it is stressed. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. Now, how do we go about testing this? So we have a sense of how we find this data, but then once we have the data that tells us where the stress is, how then do we figure out what the different parameter settings should be for Hittite? And in this case, I've kind of hand waved away three of the parameters, but this gives us a sense of how we would do this. It's just testing uh, via brute force, essentially. You have to go through and test different parameter settings over and over and over until you find something that works consistently. And in this case, what we're going to look at is the end rule parameter. So that's, again, trying to see whether we put the stress on the leftmost or rightmost group of syllables. You can see here I've picked out three different words, alwansatar, asul, and kukupalatar, which mean respectively sorcery, well-being, and deception, as examples. And you can see this parsing notation that I've got in here, and what that is every bracket, every set of brackets represents a foot, and that's a group of syllables. And that's going to be at maximum 2 syllables, except in very rare cases that don't apply to Hittite, as far as I can tell. And that could change. There's some evidence that points me maybe in that direction, but that's still to be determined. So each set of brackets is a foot. The X's mark strong heads of feet, and the periods or full stops mark the weak branches. So in each of these, you can see I've gone through and I've parsed it out and I've divided it into feet. So in the case of Alwan Satar, we can see that we have 3 different feet for each of the 4 syllables. So the first syllable is on its own, the second syllable is on its own, and then the last 2 are grouped together. Now, if we say that we have end rule left, like we have on the left side, you can see that we would end up with stress on the first syllable in all of these cases. So we would have alwansatar, assul, kukupalatar, which we know is the incorrect pronunciation based on the plene vowels that we find. If we set it to end rule right, on the other hand, we put the stress on the rightmost group of syllables. You can see because it only lands on the rightmost strong syllable, it actually skips over the last syllable completely, which is kind of left out, right? So here we get alwansatar, asul, and kukupalatar, which is exactly what we're expecting to see. So that tells us end rule right is the correct parameter setting for that particular parameter. And we go through and we do that basically with all the different parameters. So this is an easy test for end rule. And if we look at a larger data set, we can see that with this data set alone, which is actually not that large, we can already get a really good sense of how Hittite stress works, as long as we have a good enough collection of syllables with with ideally longer words, where we know the placement of the stress, and then also where we get good mixtures. You'll see in the middle here, I've marked syllable weights, and that refers to the coda of each syllable. So when we're looking at the coda, a long vowel gives more weight than a short vowel, or a syllable that ends with a consonant gives more weight than a syllable that ends in just a vowel. And so you can see that I've gone through and marked that as either super heavy or light or heavy, depending on which one we get. And that's also a helpful tool that can help us to figure out some of the differentiations between these. One of the really important ones actually for my work ended up being, I believe it was the differentiation between Eizhar and Asul, because it wasn't totally clear why here we get stress on the super heavy on the left, and here we get stress on the heavy on the right. Oh, excuse me. No, it was Eizhar and Ishas. There we are. So you can see we have a super heavy here which gets stressed, but here the super heavy is not stressed, right? So this was a really important one as well for me for figuring out that we had end rule right really in play, because otherwise this didn't make any sense, right? So this is kind of how we go about testing this. what we learn about Hittite is actually that it has a really fascinating structure. So it has what we call asymmetric trochees. So if you remember, we had four different parameters: foot headedness, parse direction, end rule, and extrametricality. And if we go back to this, the rule settings here, we find that it has asymmetric trochees. Remember that we said a trochee is strong and weak. And asymmetric, in this case, you'll notice I've got the Greek letter mu here, and that's marking morai. So under Moraic theory, like I said, basically every long vowel counts as more, every syllable that ends in a consonant counts as more. So one of the interesting things here is that we can actually get uh, a foot with two morai in the first part of a foot and still have a second syllable which composes part of that foot. And that's a little bit unusual. Most times you expect to see this broken up evenly. So either you would see two morai and that's it, or you would see one mora and one mora grouped together, but not more than that. So having one that can actually go up to three, this is a little bit unusual. It's not by any means unheard of, but Hittite exhibits this property, which is a little bit different from what we expect to see in some of the other languages in the Indo-European family. Now, one of the things, though, that is expected about this is the fact that it's a trochee. So most of the Indo-European languages, as far as we can tell, have trochaic structures. So that's a really good sign. It tells us we're on the right track. And the fact that it is asymmetric, though, is an interesting thing because that raises the question as to whether this is something that the Anatolians developed, that the Hittites developed, or whether this is something older. So that's something essentially for future research. Now, the second thing is we learned that it has left to right parsing. So if we're going through this data set, we break up these syllables starting from the left rather than from the right. That one is a little bit unusual. A lot of Indo-European languages have right to left parsing, but again, this is kind of a coin toss. Um, we have end rule right as we demonstrated with our setting positions, and we have final consonant extrametricality, and this is a really interesting thing as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in Latin and in English, we get full final syllable extrametricality. Whereas in Anatolian, we only get final consonant extrametricality. And this raises another question as to relative chronology, right? Because if languages which are a little bit later to branch off from Proto-Indo-European, like Latin and like English, or let's say more broadly Germanic, if these later languages have full final syllable extrametricality, but Hittite only has final consonant extrametricality, it raises the question as to whether this is something that was maybe developing in Proto-Indo-European or in some early stage of, say, Proto-Anatolian or something like that, and then that became fully developed by the time we get to some of the later languages. There's some other reasons that that might be possible that we'll get to in a minute, but this is just something to be thinking about when we're looking at these settings is how it compares to the other languages in the family. So let's look at what we can do with this, right? Because this is kind of the fundamental question is, well, what good is any of this? We're doing phonology on a dead language. What's the point? And the point is that not only can we do reconstructions, but we can also apply this to texts that we find. So there are some stress placement disputes. For instance, Tony Yates and Alwyn Klukhorst disagree on the stress placement in certain words. And this is just a couple of examples, but we have these two words I've shown on the screen, and I'm not going to pronounce them just yet for the sake of keeping it not poisoning the ear. But essentially, Klukhorst believes that the stress should fall on the A vowel, and Yates believes that it should be on the long vowel, that ah. And the analysis that we get once we do the parsing, and this is sort of contingent on a factor that I'll mention just briefly, actually confirms that it is on the A. So this would be pronounced then taetsi, chatraetsi, right? As opposed to taetsi, chatraetsi. Even though the long vowel is already there, this parsing actually suggests that Klukhorst is correct and it should be on the A. Now, why does Klukhorst suggest that it's on the A if he doesn't have this parsing system? Well, it's because of the thing I mentioned earlier where stressed A can become A. And we see that potentially happening here in Etsi on both of these words, right? So that's something to keep in mind is that Hittite is potentially signaling that stress was in that position and that there was just also a long vowel. Now, I mentioned that this is contingent on a certain assumption, and that's on the assumption that the Z in Hittite is ambisyllabic, or more specifically, that it is geminate. And there is some disagreement about that. Interestingly, Klukhorst and Yates disagree on this. Klukhorst believes it is singleton. Yeats believes it is geminate. Now, I've actually gone with Yeats' assumption that it is geminate here, but what's so interesting about that is that if you assume that the Z is geminate, then it necessitates this interpretation here where Yeats' placement of the stress is mistaken. So this is something to be thinking about, is that depending on which one of those interpretations you take, it will actually, they will sort of, inevitably, they will both be wrong, just depending on which approach you take here. If, again, assuming that all of this is a valid approach to this, which I feel strongly it is. Let's look at some other possible applications, and this one is a little bit more tentative. So this is a working theory that I have, and this might, change over time, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of things we might expect to see, even if this exact example might not be the best. So uh, Hittite shows vowel epenthesis in certain lexemes, and we know from other languages that vowel epenthesis can be caused by these sorts of stress structures. So there was this word alkis in probably pre-Hittite, meaning I'm so sorry, my headphones just died again. Um, let's see here. There we go. This word alkis meaning branching plant, and we've reconstructed that as Proto-Indo-European helks. That's a good reconstruction. We don't have to worry too much about that one. And the pathway from helks to alkis is we go through this middle phase, alks, where we lose the first laryngeal and the first laryngeal and the a merge together into an a in Hittite. This is a very normal development. And so then we get to alks with also devoicing of the G between, or of the G sitting just before the S. And then in the Hittite period, or in the pre-Hittite period, we get this E insertion. So let's think about a possible explanation here. If final consonant extrametricality is a new addition to either Hittite or Anatolian, like we suggested it might be on the basis of the comparison with Latin and English and other, we'll say, newer languages, for lack of a better term, then when that part of the system gets introduced, alks might be parsed as unfooted. So if we look over here at this table, you can see that in Proto-Indo-European, we have helks with some parsing. We don't know exactly what that would have been. Then we have some pre-Hittite stage, possibly as early as Proto-Anatolian, where they went to alks, and where we introduce final consonant extrametricality. And this is something of an assumption, but if we assume that it affects all final consonants, which it may not, but this is the working theory, if it affects all final consonants here, then this doesn't foot, and we need it to foot because this is an actual noun, right? We need it to be able to stand on its own and not cliticize to some other word. So in order to give it a real lexical stress and be able to actually have its own prosodic standing, we insert a vowel. And when we insert the vowel, we are able to parse it according to the algorithm, and now we have something that works. So this is a potential explanation for vowel epenthesis. There are also explanations that center around the sonority sequencing principle, which are also potentially viable options. Could be better than this, but this is an idea of the sorts of things, like I said, that we might expect to find. Now, more broadly speaking, why do this? So we've looked at a couple of examples in Hittite, but what else can we do with this? So for one thing, we have a better way of understanding Hittite texts. Hittite texts thus far have been a little bit tricky to pin down with regards to stress. So Alwyn Klukhorst wrote a wonderful book called Accent in Hittite, which is this huge text where he goes through and basically manually identifies stress on the basis of spellings. And that's very helpful. But there are a few methodological problems, and then also it doesn't systematize it. And then Tony Yates uses his optimality theoretic approach, which is also very good, but I think has its deficiencies. So this hopefully gives us a way that is a little bit clearer and a little bit more reliable, where we can now identify stress really quickly and really reliably in Hittite words. Also, poetry becomes clearer and easier to identify. So one of the big problems with this whole study, as a challenge, I mean, not in the not in the sense that it's a weakness, but in the sense of having the difficulty of dealing with it, is that Hittite poetry is not so obvious. So we actually only have a handful, about 3 texts that we know for sure these are poetry. We have one that we call the Song of Nesa, very obviously poetry. It's kind of a fun little soldier's poem. Then we have the Song of Ullikummi, which is part of a mythical text. And then we have a couple of other things that are maybe strongly suspected but not confirmed. And the problem is that although we can tell it's poetry sort of intuitively and based on context, we don't have a good way of understanding those texts yet. We have some rules that we've developed, but those rules are a little bit arcane. They're a little bit, I would say, overly flexible. They don't lock things down in a way that you would really want. Most times, poetry is the sort of thing where you can pretty quickly identify, or well, maybe not quickly, but you can identify a solid set of rules that a poet is using to create their poetry. And so far, with the rules that we've developed, that's just not entirely the case yet. So hopefully, this will allow us to unlock that feature of Hittite writing and then go on to identify more poetic texts. Like I said, also certain phonological phenomena become explainable. So it's possible that this is a good explanation for vowel epenthesis. It also helps us to resolve some different disputes over stress placement. And I didn't show this, but there are also some examples where there have been some odd findings where we said, okay, well, we found these words that have long vowels, but we really don't expect them to have long vowels there. Why are those there? This sort of defies the rules. And actually, this parsing algorithm shows that we actually do expect to find those long vowels where we find them. So this is something where we can say, now we have an explanation for why those were preserved in the places that they were. And then finally, reconstructive work on Proto-Indo-European is better informed. This being the oldest group of Indo-European languages, I think I think anyway, and obviously this is talking up my own work a little bit, but I think we have had a bit of a dearth in the scholarship when it comes to Indo-European accent, in large part because we just up until now haven't really known all that much about it from the Anatolian perspective. The other languages can give us a really good sense, especially languages like Greek and Sanskrit. Those are really wonderful tools for examining Proto-Indo-European stress. But you get ones like Balto-Slavic that are just a nightmare. And you have Anatolian, which has so far been completely unexplored, or at least very nearly completely. So the idea here is that hopefully this serves as a stepping stone that we can then use to move on to other Indo-European and specifically Anatolian languages. So with any luck, we can then turn around and say, okay, well, now we have a good understanding of how Hittite works. Let's look at Palaic. Let's look at Luvian. Let's look at Lycian and Lydian. And some of those get into really interesting territory. And that is what I'm crossing my fingers, hoping to work on for my DPhil project. I would like to be able to take a look at that, and that's kind of where this is headed, is a broader examination of the Anatolian family and also some of the languages that surrounded them. So earlier I mentioned Hattaian, that was there before the Hittites arrived, and what's so interesting is that the Hattaians had a huge influence on Hittite poetry from what little we can tell, but we don't know anything about the Hattaian stress system either. And their poetry is easy to understand, which is awesome. We love that. We love to see when the poetry is easy to understand, but their stress system has just not been touched yet. So if we can get a handle on the Hattaian stress system, what we might find is some comparisons that can be made between Hittite or Palaic or some of these other languages, and we might be able to say, oh, well, now that we understand the Hattaian stress and its poetry, we can turn around and see more clearly the similarities that it has and the influence that it might have had on Indo-European poetry in that region. The same goes for Akkadian. This is something that I'm also wanting to explore, and we have some better sense once again of how Akkadian poetry works, but its stress system, and we have a good understanding of its stress system in from a pedagogical perspective, but we have a lot of questions that still remain from a metrical phonological perspective as to how Akkadian works. So that is basically what I have for you guys. I've got a few references here. This is an extremely condensed list of what I thought were sort of the most important things. If you were wanting to look at this in more detail, we have Hugard here, who, and that one's just for the purpose of the example sentence that I gave earlier. That's in a discussion of Hittite syntax, not necessarily specifically relevant to the talk at large, but just if you were wanting to look up that sentence, you'll find that I've edited his translation just slightly to I think make some small improvements. Then we have Alwyn Klukhorst's accent in Hittite, which I mentioned, Aditi Lahiri's change in word prosody, and that's a really good overview of metrical phonology in general. I've cited the Wikipedia page from whence I pulled the map earlier, so that's there if you want to go look at it. And then Tony Yates' article on stress assignment in Hittite and Proto-Indo-European. If you are interested, like I say, this is a very condensed bibliography. I can get you a much larger set of, hey, go read this, couple dozen things. But I thought, okay, if I wanted to give everyone a sense of what is the most important, probably it would be these right here. So that's all I have for you, and I really appreciate you guys listening through that.
Thank you, absolutely. And it was a very comprehensive discussion. We understood a lot of things. We learned about new things. At the same time, there were some things that we couldn't understand. They were so complex. So I'm now going to my audience. If they have any questions, I will ask them to actually open up with their question. So,
Mhm.
dear
Yeah, and I'm
audience,
happy to also if you guys need me to go to a specific slide, I'm happy to do that as well.
yeah. So, my participants, if you have any questions, so please unmute and ask. You are welcome. We have Rahat Ahmed, Noreen Atianitu, Muntasir, Ashik, and Amirul Hussein Jewel. So,
Okay.
if you have any questions, you can unmute uh, and you ask your questions. Uh, I think it won't have to be related to the topic, but you can ask different other questions if you
Hmm.
want. I hope,
Absolutely. I mean, if
yeah,
you guys are also interested in something that I might have touched on in passing, or something that's just, hey, this
yeah,
phonological thing, could you go into that in more
yeah,
detail? I'm absolutely happy to talk about that.
yeah.
It was a new thing we learned from there. We enjoy. I enjoy it very much. That's all.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Muntasir. And I think they are familiar with different terms you have mentioned here, but
Hmm.
some of them maybe couldn't understand a few details you
Sure,
mentioned
of
about
course.
regarding stress.
Bhaiya. Exactly,
Yeah,
Bhaiya. Like, this is my first time learning about these things.
Mm,
Though we are aware of some points, so I have no questions. I better understand this first, then I will ask questions later, I guess.
of course.
mm,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
absolutely fine. That's
thank,
absolutely fine. Yeah,
yeah,
this is the sort of thing where I mean there are a lot of the terms that get involved. Like I mentioned earlier, I mean some of it, especially in metrical phonology, a lot of what we're doing is we're actually pulling from poetic terminology. And so if you
yeah,
already have a sense of what a foot is in poetry, that can be useful on some level. But it can also be confusing because we're using them slightly differently. And when I first started with this, that was a big stumbling block for me was, okay, wait, hold on. This particular author is talking about feet, but I think they're talking about poetic feet, not phonological feet.
yeah.
And people are not always clear in the literature as to exactly which one is which. So I absolutely understand that.
Yeah, and if I ask you a question like, to what extent we have learned about the Hittite language?
Mm. That's a great question, actually. Yeah, that's what's funny. Yeah, I probably should mention that. So we have if we're looking at so like I said, this covers a really large a fairly large territory. And so we have, and over the, 5 or so centuries that it was spoken, we have a fair amount of attestation. So we have a pretty good sense of a lot of what's going on in Hittite, actually quite a bit more than languages like Luvian or Palaic, or I mean, really any of the other Anatolian languages. Hittite is by far the best attested. It's not attested to the same degree, of course, as Greek is something that has just centuries and centuries of texts to work with, and Hittite has some of that. So we have some tens of thousands different texts in Hittite, and I couldn't tell you the exact number to be honest because it's changing all the time.
Yeah,
But it is, I believe, higher than 30,000 and fewer than 50,000, if I'm not mistaken. But you might get different numbers from different people. I think. Someone I heard speak recently had a good number for it, and now I can't come up with it off the top of my head. But so we have a decent idea. As a matter of fact, just this past year, Craig Melchert and Harry Hofner, who's now passed away, just published the second edition of their Grammar of the Hittite Language, which is kind of the go-to text for everything you could possibly want to know about Hittite, and probably quite a bit more than you needed to know about Hittite. So they've just published that. I think it was like 3 or 4 months ago. So it's very new, and is really, really good. So it's a very, very detailed text, and you can get quite a lot out of that. So we have a good amount that we know about it, but there is obviously more that we would like to know.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Bangla is also an Indo-European language, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and there
Yeah,
are
it's
yeah, and there are a lot of languages spoken in Bangladesh. Did you know?
mhm.
Like 41 languages are spoken here in Bangladesh. So
Okay.
very interesting, and they belong to four different language families. Okay,
Wonderful.
yeah,
Yeah. And that's actually something that is worth mentioning to you guys. So Aditi Lahiri, who I mentioned kind of at the end here, might be a name that you're familiar with, because
India.
she's from India, but she is a Bangla speaker.
Yeah,
And a lot of her work focuses on the uh, Germanic prosody and metrical phonology, but she actually does have some work on Bangla as well. So this is something that, as a matter of fact, she and her team are in India right now, doing recordings, and trying to get some more data for a new project they've just started.
yeah.
So as soon as they get back, I think I will probably have a lot of data to go through.
Okay, thank you. And maybe if I ask some general and simple questions, my
Sure.
participants will learn from you, and it will be
Yeah, of
better
course.
for them to understand a lot of things. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. So let me ask some general questions first. Can you
Mhm.
briefly explain what metrical phonology is and why it is relevant to Hittite?
Great. So
Though it
metrical
was mentioned
phonology.
before, yeah,
Mhm.
but
Yeah,
yeah,
I'll kind of go into that in a little bit more detail then. So metrical phonology is the study of stress and stress patterns. And essentially what we're trying to do when we're studying metrical phonology is learn whether there are any typological universals. That means we're looking at, across languages, are there any similarities that we can pick out where we can say, okay, broadly speaking, this is how people do stress. And if we can find something like that, which it seems like we can, then we have a much better understanding of how the human brain actually does what it does when it comes to stressed languages. And the reason that we're concerned about it in Hittite has a lot to do with, because I mentioned that Hittite is the essentially the oldest well-attested Indo-European language. We want to see not only in living languages how that works, but we want to see how that works over time. And our best attested by far language groups in the world, historically speaking, are the Indo-European and the Semitic languages. And so if we're looking at languages to get a sense of how, um, if there are any patterns as to how people develop stress systems over the course of some thousands of years, we have to look at Indo-European and we have to look at Semitic. And this is what Hittite gets us, is a really good window into the oldest Indo-European language that we have. And we can look at that and say, okay, this is the farthest back we can go with this. Can we use that as a tool to help us understand what might have happened even before that, and then how that developed into the languages that we have, how that developed into the languages that we have now?
yeah. And what makes Hittite an interesting language for metrical phonological analysis? Yeah, it already some answer has been got from your speech now, right now,
Of
from your
course.
previous answer.
Mhm.
And at the same time, my question is, how does metrical phonology in Hittite compare to other Indo-European languages?
Right. So one of the big things that we're concerned about when we're looking at this is, like I said, my joke, but not a joke, that I do phonology on dead people. This is um, kind of a twofold goal here. So on the one hand, Hittite is interesting because all of its speakers are dead, and because there are no descendant languages. It simply died out. So this, in that way, helps us to stretch the limits of what we can do with our current methodology. And that's what sets it apart from what we do most of the time in metrical phonology, which is to work either with living languages or with languages that have living descendant speakers that we can compare to past texts or past recordings or whatever the case might be. And Hittite just doesn't have any of that available. So this is one of the things that makes it so interesting, is because it is this wild west of metrical phonology where we look at it and we go, okay, well, how do we even approach this? And that's a lot of what this study tries to answer, is how we have to approach it, and is that even possible? The good news is it turns out it is possible, but it is very challenging. And
Okay, so there's a broader question for you. For example, I want to know about how does your study contribute to our understanding of Proto-Indo-European stress systems?
yeah,
So
great question.
when
Yeah.
we reconstruct a language,
Hmm.
so obviously the language which is not present now, which is
Hmm.
already dead, if we can get some structure from it, and if we can compare the structure with that of other languages or sister
Hmm.
languages, obviously we will get some insights from it and can get to a parent language, and
Yeah.
through it a more old language. So yeah,
Hmm.
what will be your answer?
Yeah. There are a couple of things there. One is that it compares really interestingly in that there are some clear similarities. We can see, like I said, it is a trochaic language, which is clearly similar to, I mean, most of the other Indo-European languages that I'm aware of use some kind of trochaic structure. And so that is one way where we can look at it and say, okay, well, that's clearly similar. But we see other things like the extrametricality thing where it's not so clear that that is similar. And that's a good clue that maybe we should be looking there as something to investigate in terms of maybe what people might do with stress systems over time. Um, and the other thing that is important with regards to Indo-European stress is that Proto-Indo-European stress, that is relatively poorly understood. So there have been a variety of different suggestions over the years. It's very probable that it was trochaic, like I say, but there are also questions as to whether maybe it had pitch accent, right, which works a little bit differently than the stress accent that we find in Hittite or in English. So and you'll have to forgive me. I'm not familiar with Bangla well enough to know if Bangla uses pitch accent, but some modern Indo-European languages do. So we have Norwegian, we have Swedish, ancient Greek used pitch accent, and although it's not Indo-European, we also find languages like Japanese using pitch accent as part of their stress system. So one of the things that we're trying to find out as well is if we have languages like ancient Greek, which have this kind of interesting interaction between pitch accent and stress, and then we have this very old language which does not have pitch accent but which does have stress. Well, how is it that we reconstruct what was going on in Proto-Indo-European? And this is a valuable part of that question.
Yeah, thank you. And the next question is, how did you actually become interested in Hittite?
Oh man. So that's a funny story because what actually happened was more or less an accident. As in your introduction at the beginning, you said um, you kind of mentioned the fact that I had started out with languages like Russian, French, and Italian, which of course are very much alive and very much still being used. And then I somehow ended up doing this. And that has to do with kind of a long, winding path. But because of my interest in things like Biblical Hebrew, which of course is not a living language anymore, although we do have modern Hebrew, which is its sort of indirect descendant. Um, and then some of the things I had done with Semitic linguistics and Semitic historical linguistics, um, I ended up with sort of an intrinsic interest, I guess, in this region of the world and the languages that inhabited it. And I found out when I started off at Oxford that my advisor was a specialist in Anatolian linguistics and in Indo-European linguistics more broadly. And he sent me an email from Turkey on a dig site and said, "Hey, this is where I am right now." And it was just kind of a casual sign off. And that piqued my interest, and I said, "Well, I don't really know that much about that, but I sure would like to. That sounds like a lot of fun. So anyway, I ended up convincing him to let me work in Anatolian linguistics. Oh, I think you've been muted. Sorry.
Okay, okay, sorry. So I become astonished thinking of how you could complete your honors in three languages, French, then and then. How?
I didn't sleep very much. I don't recommend it. It was it was objectively not healthy.
Yeah.
This was well, my first language is Italian, so that helps. I was able to, you know,
Are
do
you from it?
relatively.
Are you from Italy?
Yes, originally,
Yeah.
yeah. My
Okay.
parents are Americans, but I was born in Italy, so that's my first language. So that's another part of this whole thing, right? Is if you are like I mean, all of you here, right, are probably speakers of English, Bangla, and potentially some others as well, right?
Yeah.
And I think when you grow up with that kind of environment, it naturally can sort of lean you this way because you ask questions about, well, this one language that I speak does this, but the other one does this, and why is that, right? And I think that's a fun way to get started in all of this.
Yeah. Thank you. And you work in the language and brain lab, right, as a
Hmm.
research assistant. So
Yes, yeah,
it is a different topic than the topic of phonology, isn't it?
of
So
course, yes, yeah.
yeah. So could you please explain a bit about it, the
Yeah,
work?
so the Language and Brain Lab does a few different really cool things. And I'll actually see if I can find their website so that you guys can have a look at that on your own time as well. But I think this is the right one. Yes. Um, oh goodness. Hold on. Let me stop sharing and I'll share the correct screen with you. There's that. And there we go. Okay. So this is the Language of Brain Lab website, and you can get a sense, especially if you go into fieldwork and publications or some of the people in here in our research. There are a few different projects that we're working on. One of the main ones that I'm assigned to is the Pertinacity project, and this is the one that has to do with Bangla aspiration patterns, and that one is has a few different papers that have been published, or at least one paper that has been published related to that. And then there's this FlexSR project, which I'm not directly involved in most of the time, but is a really, really cool project. This has to do with um, uh, processing of auditory data. So if you have, I don't know, Alexa or Siri or any of these different AI assistants, you might be aware that if you've ever tried to talk to them, they're kind of terrible. And this is a project that basically has found a way with very, very minimal training data to essentially match that performance. And as you're well aware, with neural networks and this kind of thing that do a lot of this auditory processing for our AI assistants and so on, those are often trained with just huge amounts of data. And as it turns out, that doesn't have to be the case. So the FlexSR project kind of looks at that and says, well, how much data do we actually need? And they've trained it with really, really minimal data and have gotten stellar results. So we're working on that, and that is based on the interface of phonetics and phonology that my boss and my advisor, Aditi Lahiri, has been working on. So she has a few different papers on underspecification in phonology, which is a whole different topic. But the FlexSR neural network is kind of well, I shouldn't. I guess it is sort of a neural network, but anyway, the FlexSR project is sort of founded on that theoretical premise and then works from there. So, and then the other thing that I do is I work on EEG experimentation. So this is measuring people's brain waves, working on German verbs and the ways that that is stored in the mental lexicon, which obviously is sort of its own theoretical underpinning that we have a mental lexicon to begin with. That's its own debate that I'm not, I'm not familiar with enough to be able to get into, but that's another fun project that we have going on there with some of our researchers, and I kind of have my hands, sort of doing different things with all of those.
Yeah, thank you. We know about different branches of linguistics, right?
Hmm.
including psycholinguistics, statistical linguistics, and comparative. That is also actually methodology, comparative methodology, or comparative linguistics, etc.
Hmm.
Neurolinguistics, forensic linguistics, etc. So, d- does Oxford have all the faculties or subjects regarding all these disciplines, incorporating all these disciplines?
That's a good question. So Oxford has most of them. And I have certainly they have some that are really, really strong. They have a very strong comparative and historical linguistics section. They have a very strong phonology section. They have very strong syntax. And then for individual language groups, they also have some very strong people. So if you were someone who's interested in working with Celtic linguistics, for instance, we have some really, really good professors in Celtic linguistics. Um, and we're one of only two universities in the United Kingdom that teaches Anatolian languages. So that is also really, really cool. It's as far as I'm aware, it is just us and UCL that teach Anatolian languages in the United Kingdom. So they have lots of different sections. I don't know that we have a psycholinguistics section per se, but at least in the research lab, we do have psycholinguistics projects being run. But I hesitate to say whether I don't know the extent to which we actually have teaching in that particular subfield, but we do have representatives in I would say most of the major sub branches. I'm not 100% sure about forensic linguistics. I don't know that we have anyone in that space, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, okay, no problem. And you were giving your presentation on the Hittite language, right? Phonology
Mhm.
of Hittite. So, what future research do you think is needed in Hittite phonology? And obviously, the more and more research we get, the more to come, right? The more to know
Yeah,
about this
absolutely.
language.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, how can a person go into or dive into the field of Hittite? What's the way, and what do you think from your
Yeah.
perspective that where to focus if
Mm.
someone wants to just start from the very beginning? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an awesome question because the that is one of the biggest challenges with something like Hittite, which really doesn't get taught most places. So if you're wanting to dive into it on your own, well, how do you do that? I mean, that's a really good question. And until I got here, I could not have told you that answer at all. So the if you're interested in something like Hittite, there are a couple of different things you can do. I genuinely, as much as it is a really um, it's a challenge. I think a good place to start would be something like the new Hittite grammar that has been put out by Craig Melchert. If you were to read through that grammar, he's very, very thorough and will give not only a description of Hittite grammar and its historical context, but he also identifies a lot of different issues that are still outstanding and says, okay, well, we know this, but there's this little thing that we actually still don't know. Or we know this, but this section of it is still unclear. Or he might, in some cases, say, "Hey, this particular thing is really anybody's guess, and we don't know how to handle it." So one of those things actually is stress. So his most recent chapter on Hittite stress is very short. It doesn't really give a whole lot of information other than some basic tools as to how to identify it, because up until now there really hasn't been a lot of research done on it. When with regards to other issues in phonology, I mean there are all kinds of debates that are going on in Hittite phonology. Especially so there's this ongoing question of whether Hittite when in the Hittite script you will find sometimes consonants that are doubled, and in languages like Italian that means they're doubled. That's that. But it's actually not so clear in Hittite that that's necessarily the case. I tend to think it is, but it's possible that this actually reflects a voicing distinction. There are some people, I think Alwyn Klukhorst tends to take the position that it is no, excuse me, no. As a matter of fact, he's precisely the opposite. But there are some people who think that it is voicing rather than doubling, and so that's there are still questions about some of these things that are even some fairly basic questions that you would sort again in a modern living language we would sort of have as givens and we'd be able to move on that in Hittite are just not anywhere close to as obvious. One of those again that I kind of mentioned in relation to my project is the question of whether or not the Z in Hittite can be doubled if that tse sound, if it's always double or if it's usually singleton, excuse me, but can be doubled or some other combination there. That is still an open question, and we have disagreements about this. And you'll see, like I say, Melchert will give explanations of that. So I think as much as and I love the man dearly, but as much as the writing can be very dense sometimes, that is a good place to start because it will give you not only a sense of how the language works at a base level, but will also give you a sense of where to look if you're looking for things to do more research on.
Yeah, thank you. And since you are focusing on the phonology of this language, so I assume that much has been done already on the morphology, semantics, etc. That's why you can focus on the phonology.
Um, yes and no. So some of the morphology is actually not entirely obvious yet. We have these fun little enclitic particles that show up in Hittite that uh, and again, this is something that Craig discusses in his new book, but um, that are really unclear as to their exact usage. We sort of have a sense that some of these are probably some kind of a locative particle. Maybe they have a telicizing thing going on. But I would say that the semantics in those cases are really still pretty unclear, with some at best vague ideas about what those are doing. And the morphology as well is something that, well, actually, I would say the morphology we have a probably reasonably good handle on all, but that's not to say that there aren't things still to look at. There are absolutely still questions that are out there, especially with regards to the diachronic or historical morphology. You can look at all kinds of different issues with certain verbs that there are two main conjugation classes of verbs, for instance, in Hittite, and if you're looking at the morphology of those verbs. They do sometimes seem to get their wires crossed and they'll have one from a particular category and one from another. It's not always clear how that happens. And then a friend of mine who's here doing his DPhil is actually working on Hittite nominal morphology and is trying to do a sort of a synchronic look at how the Hittite system works on its own terms, right? Because in Latin, for instance, if any of you have ever studied Latin, you'll see, oh, we get all these declension tables and they're really nice and pretty, and they actually work the large majority of the time. And you've got, your five different declensions with your whatever, and it all works great. And then you have the way that you understand it historically, which is different. Um, or the opposite thing would be in Old Irish, where if you're looking at Old Irish, we have the historical way of looking at things. We have our long O stems, our long A stems, our long Ya stems, so on and so forth, which don't really help us all that much when it comes to learning the language, because the language at that time had the effects of those things, but doesn't really show them explicitly. So it's very hard to tell just by looking at a word which one it is. And in practice, they're fairly mixed. So this is sort of the thing that my friend is looking at now. Is, well, we in Hittite we have these two things that are sort of in opposition: the historical and the current state of Hittite, to the extent that it's current. And he's trying to systematize that and find a way of saying, okay, well, here's a good paradigmatic way of looking at it in Hittite as Hittite.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So we know about language revitalization
Mm,
and language reconstruction at the same
yeah.
time. So is it the same or are they different?
Reconstruct. So, oh, yeah. So reconstruction can be a part of revitalization efforts, but they are in principle separate. So when you're looking at a reconstruction of a language, that is going to mean that we're looking at historical data and we're trying to put that together and try and recreate what that language might have sounded like at some point. Um, and that's especially true of something like Proto-Semitic or Proto-Indo-European that are well attested in history, and we can actually do that.
Yeah.
There are others, where that's not so much the case, right? I mean, if you were looking at well, really any of the North American languages, that's basically impossible. We don't have the historical data for it. We can go back maybe a few hundred years at most and get a sense of what some of the local origin languages sounded like, but it's really pretty limited. Um, just because of lack of written record, or actually in some cases destruction of written record, also. That can also be a problem. um uh Language revitalization, on the other hand, is usually more concerned with, say, you have a particular, often a particular ethnic group that says, well, we used to speak this language and we considered it a part of our cultural identity, but it has been, either taken away. Well, taken away for a variety of different reasons. I mean, that could be, colonialism. That could be any number of different things, really. And we find that once again, actually, especially in North America, there are lots of people that I knew personally living in Oklahoma who were learning their tribal languages, that were still spoken, but in very, very small communities, and they were trying to grow those communities. Um, and in some cases, that can involve reconstruction. So if you're looking at Cornish in the United Kingdom, that can sometimes involve some reconstruction. But usually those two things are separate, but not always. They
Yeah.
can go together.
Yeah, we can understand that. Thank you.
Hmm.
I already said that there are 41 languages spoken in Bangladesh, and the most spoken language here in Bangladesh is Bangla, obviously. And
Hmm.
there are different ethnic groups here, indigenous
Hmm.
people, and they have their own languages.
Hmm.
So for their economic growth, for their jobs, they have to actually learn Bangla. Okay,
Right, right.
day by day, more and more people are actually diving into the Bangla language. They're using Bangla,
Hmm.
and there is a tendency that they forget their own language. They do
Hmm.
not get that their own language as heritage language. Okay,
Hmm.
so this is a tendency here in Bangladesh, and
Yeah, of course.
yeah,
This was also true with the Pamir languages that I worked with. One of the speakers that I was talking with, he said that, and he was from Pakistan, but he and those languages are spoken all across especially the Pianj River Valley. So that can be all the way over to Xinjiang province in China, and also in Tajikistan and Pakistan, and even some parts of northern India, I think. But he was saying that, because of the region that his village was in, this is something that was happening with their languages as well. That many of the younger speakers were choosing to learn Urdu, instead of using Wahi or something like that. And this is something that we see all over the world, in different places, depending on what is sort of the large, the powerful language, basically, of the area.
yeah. And as part of the MTBMLE, for example, mother tongue based multilingual education, so we can
Hmm.
see the Bangladesh government made a policy of teaching the people or indigenous people education in their own language. That
Yeah.
that yeah, that means a lot.
Yeah,
And
that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
so I have another question here. It is,
Hmm.
if a person wants to do his research or conduct his research in the field of language reconstruction, so
Hmm.
how will you motivate that person? Hmm, that's the
How to
question.
motivate that person?
Yeah, why he would do that? Why would he do or conduct research on language reconstruction, and
Mm,
how constructing or reconstructing languages help us or help humanity?
sure. Yeah. I think at the core of reconstructing, well, let me back up. So I think the basic core of language reconstruction essentially comes down to the same reason that we do history, or any other variety of studying humans. We want to learn not just who we are now, but also who we used to be, because a lot of times who we used to be as, a species can really impact who we might be moving forward, right? Or might have some lasting effects that we might not have been aware of, or whatever. And that can be something that I think is really, really valuable for learning about our progress and how it is that we think. And again, I work on Indo-European reconstruction, which is kind of the biggest one if you're going to be, looking at linguistic reconstruction. And to be honest, I think that's a little bit of a shame. I think it would be really nice to have a lot more reconstructionists out there working on all kinds of different language groups. And we do have some. But we the challenge of reconstruction is we have to work with what we have written record of for the most part. And so that means mostly, like I say, Semitic, Indo-European, to a certain extent, Sino-Tibetan. Um, and that's it is basically a project that aims to understand how humans think and how it is that we do what we do over long periods of time and how it is that we've developed and all of the different machinations that go on in our heads as we're, what we do when we speak is a really phenomenally complex process. And understanding how it is that practice develops is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is the last question of our webinar today.
Mhm.
So through this program, Linguistics Talk, this program, we aim to create a strong network of linguists and linguistics students. Okay. So how do you see this initiative? And do you have any suggestions for us?
I think this is wonderful. Like I said at the beginning, this is something that I think is super, super valuable because I believe really strongly in democratization of information. None of what I do as a researcher matters unless people hear about it, unless they start thinking about it, unless they then turn around and get to do their own
Exactly.
work, right? None of that matters. So I think this is a really valuable way of going about that. I mean, I know a handful of people from your side of the world, but really not that many. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for us to kind of get together and talk and chat and get a sense of what everybody's doing. And that kind of exchange of information is super, super valuable, especially given that we're now, in the information age. We're doing this over Zoom. I mean, this is something that if we're looking at reconstructions and history and the way that humans have developed over time, I mean, this is something that just has never been possible before in human history. So this kind of initiative, I think, is a really, really good thing for you guys, and I appreciate your students coming to this and um, and sitting in and taking part in that project.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we are so happy to have you in our program, and we have learned a lot of things from you. Thank you for your valuable time, and we will be grateful to you forever, inshallah. And maybe, inshallah, we'll be having you in many of our future sessions, inshallah.
Appreciate it.
Uh,
Thank you so much. It
yeah,
was really great
thank you.
speaking to you guys. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.